Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how Flux works in Excel. Now the short answer is it's a step sequencer that modulates the rate in the rhythm panel, but I'm going to break it down and show you exactly how we can use it using two examples. The first example is going to be a one shot, so let's see how that works. So if we turn off the rhythm panel temporarily, we can hear the simple one shot with no modulation. And the rhythm panel works by modulating whatever we tell it to modulate using the mod effects. So we can see down here that we're modulating the pan position, the filter, and the phaser. So you should be able to hear one defining modulation by this rhythm panel. If we turn off the flux, you should be able to hear a consistent modulation at a rate determined by this parameter here. So it's a consistent rate of modulation. So the cool thing about Flux is it allows us to modulate, which is just a fancy word for change. It allows us to modulate this rate of the rhythm panel, which is our defining modulation. So at the moment, before we turn Flux on, notice the indicator, that little yellow line is fixed because that is telling you what the rate of this rhythm panel is modulating at. But if we turn on the Flux, notice what happens to the indicator now. Notice how it's dancing around all over the place? That's because we have a step sequencer modulating this rate. And we have a few different controls for determining how this modulation happens. We have an amount parameter, which, as you expect, determines the amount of modulation we do. So we can see with a tiny amount, the indicator moves around a little bit, but not a lot. Whereas with a really high amount, it's all over the place. I like about here. If we dive into edit, the step sequencer works pretty much as you'd expect. So it's a simple step sequencer and we can determine how many steps there are with these parameters here. We can drag the steps up and down. We can determine the speed at which we move through the step sequencer, whether it's say a half or a bar or a quarter or an eighth or so on. And probably my favorite bit of this Flux is you can randomize these step positions by hitting randomize. So very quickly as you're playing around with ideas, you can keep hitting randomize until you get the result you want. And it's worth noting that this step sequencer doesn't re-trigger every time you trigger a new MIDI note. The result of this is every time you trigger a note, you're pretty much guaranteed to start at a different position within that step sequence. The upshot of this is you have this nice random modulation essentially. So every time I trigger the note, it's going to do a different modulation than the time I triggered it before. Try and listen for the way the modulation changes every time I trigger a specific note. Pretty cool, right? And that was an example in notes mode. Let's give you another example using, again, Flux, but using it in a different way, using a preset I made in loops mode. In this example, I'm using Flux mode to create some nice, somewhat random, but pretty fluid and organic movement through the stereo image. So before I turn on Flux, notice how it still moves through the stereo image because we have this pan turned on, we have this mod effect turned up pretty high. So you still hear the sound moving through the stereo image, but it moves through in a consistent way. And when I turn on Flux, notice it will start to move in a somewhat unpredictable way. Granted, it's still slow and subtle, but it's definitely noticeable. And again, it's different every time subtly. So we're creating some natural, organic movement in our sound. And in terms of the specific settings for setting up the Flux in this particular example, there was one key detail I did differently. Because the rate is on the left-hand side of things, it's using slower modulations. You can see it's set at a bar at the moment. So we're looking at modulation times around a bar or 2 bars or 4 bars or maybe half a bar or a quarter division. So essentially slower than the previous example. What we had to do is slow down the step sequencer within Flux. So we hit edit and we chose a step time of a half. Just because we're doing slower modulations, we need to move through these different steps slower for the whole thing to work. And there you go. That's how we can use Flux to take our sounds to the next level.